Hello, my name is Paul Johnston. I am the CTO of a company called Movivo. We are a serverless company. We have an Android app that we have put out into developing countries and various other places that allows people to earn free airtime on their mobile phones. So we're it's quite a fun thing that we do, and it's quite a good thing. It means that they can earn it for free. I also write a blog on Medium, and that's me on Twitter. So find me, say hello. I will probably say hello back because I spend all my time on Twitter. I write a lot of blog posts on Medium, some of which are quite ranty, but they're quite fun. I am also the person that coined the term Jeff. This room is named Jeff because I wrote a blog post. But that's a whole other story. Go and read the blog post about serverless, and we could have called it Jeff, but we didn't. So a little bit about Movivo. We've been going about a year. We are not a services company. We don't help you sort out your serverless. We are just a company that does serverless stuff within our company. We made the decision about a year ago when I joined the company to go AWS Lambda mad. Which meant that we took on AWS Lambda and started playing with it. But back a year ago, what you probably don't realize is that Lambda was a nightmare, and we kind of knew what was coming, and we kind of knew what was going to happen, but it was a bit of a shock when we got there. In terms of what we've done with the technology, we've had over 1 million users. We have Lambda and API gateway, and we have DynamoDB backend. So we've got a bunch of the services via AWS because back then there wasn't anything else particularly. So we kind of had to do it via Lambda. We started off with Lambda. We started off with API gateway. We had large functions in Lambda. We had stored a lot of data in the wrong kinds of ways. And we learned a lot of things about how we shouldn't do AWS Lambda and serverless as an approach. And we've kind of missed out on things like deployment strategies. We basically just built it and had a go. And what we found over time is that you can't really just transfer an N-tier architecture straight over into a serverless world. It just doesn't quite translate. And so what this talk is all about is pretty much trying to explain a little bit about where we've come from and where we would like to be going with serverless and where we think serverless will be going as well. By the way, just a slight aside, after talking to a bunch of you over the last, over yesterday and this morning, what I found is there are a lot of questions that you want to ask. So I'm going to basically do a very short talk compared to what I would have done, and I'm going to leave a lot of space for Q&A. Is that okay with everyone? Are you, as one person just said yes. I'm just going to go with, no one said no. Okay, we will. And if there's only one question at the end, it's going to be a very short talk. So for the reasons that, a lot of people talk about the technology as being important. A lot of people talk about, there are always servers, that's my response. I have a mantra whenever I'm talking to my quite small team, which is we're all about reducing maintenance. A managed service someone maintains for you, and basically if it goes wrong, you can go, grrr, I don't like you, please fix it. And they will probably do it. So the idea is not to just be cool and clever, it's to reduce maintenance. And that's how we are a company of, we've got 4 people at the moment. We are hiring. We are looking for someone to come on board with the serverless stuff. We're looking for someone to come on board with Android. But the whole thing is we're a tiny, tiny tech team. But we've got so many good managed services that it allows us to take those ideas and things that we've learned and produce something that a startup of 10 or 20 people, we've got a better system in a lot of ways because of that. And it's the easiest way to run code without having the nuts and bolts of servers. So what I'm going to do is kind of pick different bits, and I'm going to run through. The top bit is kind of where we are. That's now. And that's the future. So just so we can run through this pretty quickly, okay? Everyone happy with that? So I'm going to leave them up. I'll put the slides somewhere. You can find them later. So the core of serverless, everyone seems to think that AWS Lambda is serverless, but it's actually not. The function as a service, you've got very low maintenance in terms of servers and even code if it's quite small, stateless, highly scalable, and the rules that we kind of govern with our function as a service is do one thing well. Don't do 74 things in a single function. Don't put express into your Lambda function. It's an idiotic thing to do. Basically keep them small, keep them easy to understand, easy to unit test. 0 or 1 data transformations. Don't overcomplicate what you're trying to do. The data transformations, the updates, the creates, the deletes, just keep one of them. Just do one and then have another Lambda function to do the next bit. But to do that, you don't chain them together. You don't invoke inside. You then chain them through an event structure of some description, but we'll come to that bit later. I got told off by my colleague for the next bit. Minimizing libraries, preferably none. Use libraries for what they're meant for. Don't just add them in because you found it on Stack Overflow. And then some of the things that we're kind of hoping are going to come up in the next few months and years, we'd love to be able to use environment variables or something equivalent to those, because running different code based upon environment is actually quite a difficult thing to do at the moment. You kind of need a deployment strategy for that. Shared libraries, I'd love to be able to upload one library and use it everywhere. That'd be helpful as well. I'd also love to have binary support. So we're kind of hoping that these kinds of things are going to come in, because these will allow us to run different types of programs. And in terms of the future, we also think that there's going to be the idea of priority functions. So you basically say, pay a little bit more, and this one will always be available. That would be a really nice thing, AWS. Queuing, we'll come back to queuing a bit later. Authentication and authorization. So with serverless environment, you've got your auth zeros and various things like that, but you've also got Cognito. Cognito is brilliant, by the way. I will happily tell everybody to use it. For what we use it for, it's actually really, really helpful. But because you've got a stateless environment, you need to know who you're talking to and what access they have. And at the moment, there are a bunch of third-party options that are really, really good. So stop rolling your own, please. It's just going to cause complication later on. And this is all about reducing maintenance at some point in the process. And basically, the longer something goes on, the more you have to maintain it. So I would suggest at the moment that we still have to define good best practices on security, but I think they're going to be coming. So I think also that you've got your good solutions out there. Look at them, evaluate them. And the other thing that we think may come up in the next few months and years is integration of multiple services through an authentication system. So I've got a friend who's really excited about the idea of basically being able to log in and then that service do a call somewhere else to find out information for you without you then having to, so not coming back and then going out again, but having connections elsewhere. So there's some interesting things in terms of the future of authentication and authorization, but essentially it comes back to those two things at the top. Don't overcomplicate it. Just keep it easy to manage. So data. There is the school of thought that everything is RDBMS first. I think we've kind of gone way past that now, but still in a lot of companies that I've seen, it's basically, everything's got to have a relational database behind it. So it's actually a load of rubbish. You've got to learn to use the right tools for the right job. We have seen that, we literally don't have a relational database in our system at the moment, which might sound scary and crazy, but we don't. Basically, RDBMS and ORMs have been holding back people from using the right tools for a long time. So one of the things we've got now, we've got a bunch of managed data services, but they're often used inappropriately, and ORMs are a bad thing most of the time, I think, because basically if you can't do a SQL query, you shouldn't be using ORMs, and that seems to happen more often. So in terms of looking at the future, I think we need to be moving towards, again, a managed scaled service, managed scaled storage. A little bit about country and region. At the moment we have, I think we're going to be moving In the future, I'm hoping we're going to have systems that allow us to have data storage in various different countries for the purposes of data protection. Because at the moment, with managed services at the moment, data is stored in specific regions, but you don't know necessarily if it's covered by the rules of the country that you're trying to get the data in and out of. So at the moment, it's a bit of a mess. And it would be really nice, someone please could create a service where they basically have a data store in each country, and we can still query it as a one thing. That would be really helpful. I don't actually know how you do that, but if you work in that kind of a company, then please come and talk to me later. But I think the other thing is we're going to have to come up with different ways of understanding distributed data. RDBMS are often one cloud, one server in the cloud somewhere, and I think we need to move away from that. And that will require different types of technology and different ways of coding. So that's something in terms of the future that we think is going to be coming along. Events and streaming data. When you have a monolith, you basically talk to yourself quite a lot. So you send us something else, and something else goes back here, and there's this big, spaghetti. But you press a button, and it unit tests fine, so you're okay. Which is not the way it should be. But what we've seen is that when you move towards a more function as a service type thing, nano function type solution, you need to be able to queue events in a more services-based way. And I think, by the way, just on this point here, the parallelism, the stories of the image processing, I don't think that's a particularly good way of showing off how good AWS Lambda and all of these systems are. So don't assume that that's the right way of using AWS Lambda just because every single vendor provides it as a solution. The way that we've approached the problem at the moment is that we use DynamoDB to trigger events. So we push something into a table, and then out it comes. I'd really like to have a much better way of doing it than that is auditable, and I'm kind of finding out more about various different bits while I'm here. But I think over time we're going to have the serverless queue as being something that's a core part of the system. So we're not invoking functions themselves. And I think the other part of kind of coming back to events and streaming data is that we need to look at logging, we need to look at system state, and we need to be able to audit in a better way. And at the moment, that's a real problem for serverless systems, knowing where we are at this point. Okay, so quick point on EC2, because I'm not going to dwell on this. Basically, cloud does not equal instances. If you're just running a server on EC2, you are not using the cloud. And serverless is that evolutionary step. Cloud is far more about using services for the right reasons at the right times. And so, as I say there, the biggest security hole I've seen is actually EC2 instances. So basically, the more you can get rid of them, the better. And they know this. And I think over time, we're going to see the vendors, all of the vendors, pushing us in a route that increases security for us and for them. But I think that's going to need new tutorials and new perceptions over time. So I'm rushing through this. If you want me to slow down or have a quick question, shout, but we will have questions at the end. I think API Gateway is the key to using AWS Lambda. If you use AWS Lambda on its own, you end up with a problem. And we've found that basically it's your front end. It's exactly what it says. It's a gateway to your API. I would again point at Cognito to give you the access to API Gateway if you haven't noticed that you can change API Gateway. And I know I'm talking about AWS a lot. The other services will all catch up with other vendors in various different ways or have different solutions for this kind of a thing. But essentially, unless you've got a way of putting authentication in some way into your API Gateway solution, they're going to have a problem. And Cognito's done a very good job for us on that. I think the big thing we find is it's actually difficult to set up. It's actually really complicated. I'd like let's have a simple solution, press a button, and let's have 3, endpoints that go to this Lambda function. That would be really nice. But at the moment, we're not quite there. And also, being able to use other auth solutions may be useful for us. Am I going too fast, or are you all right? Thumbs up, everyone. Good. You're all listening, at least. Frameworks. I'm kind of going to go, I can't stand frameworks. As a general rule, frameworks produce a lot of technical debt. They produce a lot of maintenance headaches later on. And you need to use as minimal a framework as possible for the right reasons. Basically, when we had Ruby on Rails and Django and all of that kind of stuff, you'd write a command and then you'd have a full thing with routing and everything else. You basically are taking large chunks of that out and replacing them with services. So don't then go back and go, well, let's just plonk that one big thing into your functions as a service. It's the wrong thinking in terms of that. But we do need more frameworks. We need more of these ideas to come out. We need more thought into how to do things differently. Everyone knows how we use servers, and everyone knows how we do that. That's been around 15, 20 years, but we really need to think differently about how we do that. Also, in terms of deployment, these things are quite hard to retrofit sometimes, and I think configuration and code need to go together. I think over time we will begin to see far more solutions where the code is actually integrated into the config rather than the other way around. We have a bunch of major cloud vendors that do this. We're going to have a whole bunch more. And if my conversations here are anything to go by, several more just from these conversations here. AWS is, unfortunately, for all of the other vendors, the most complete at present. That will not necessarily stay the same. And I'm quite looking forward to competitors coming along that do something, do some of the things better. But please don't copy. Please can you innovate over the top and above? Because at the moment, if you just come out with an AWS Lambda solution that's similar and quicker, it's actually not going to make any difference because the services, the other things around it are what matter. Data infrastructure, I've kind of briefly touched on this a bit earlier. We are going to need to move towards a managed data infrastructure somewhere along the line. You know, gone are the days of someone basically looking after absolutely everything certainly for startups in terms of data. We still need to manage it, we still need to look after it, but someone else can manage the scaling. It's just complicated to scale data systems. And also, I think we need to consider managed services across the board. So what we used to do was build an RDBMS, shove it all in, and then we used to do SQL for our search. And I think things like search and other types of service will come out in the near future, where they will be the best of breed, and there's no way we're going to be able to produce that. Use the people, use the services because they've got the people to do all the clever things. Stop trying to do all the things in your framework or just because you can. Okay, so one big problem with AWS Lambda and all of the services at the moment is that you can't do good logging. You can log absolutely everything you particularly want, but you can't then go and interrogate it easily. So there are ways around that, but they're roll your own kind of ways, and it's difficult to get around. And much as we all use tail minus F to look at everything, actually we use that an awful lot more for an awful lot more things than we realized. We used it for auditing, we used it for a whole bunch of stuff. And now we don't have that. We've got to start working out what we did use it for and provide the tools for that. So I'm kind of hoping that someone's going to come up with a decent service for logging. So maybe if you want to get into the serverless world, please create a system that does really good management of logs, because then we can start to do proper debugging and auditing and everything else. And I think that's a big opportunity for somebody. Please. Deployment, we literally just deployed everything via Terraform at the moment. If you're using CloudFormation, I've struggled with CloudFormation, but Terraform has done a pretty good job for us. Deployment tools are behind the curve. A number of them, still a few months ago, were not providing Lambda as a solution for deployment, which was nuts as far as I was concerned. Everyone can do EC2 because we've had it for a long time. It's still behind the curve, so we need the tools to catch up. Testing is harder. Testing becomes a lot more complicated, but now, for example, we have Terraform in our company, and that allows us to create a staging environment. We can press a button, get a staging environment. That actually allows us to now do integration testing with new stuff as we're going forwards. And I can't take a huge amount of credit for that. Someone else did the Terraform stuff, and they've done it brilliantly. But it's now allowed us to, instead of having to push things to live and hope, it allows us to do some very, very cool things around testing and checking how you might be able to deploy different tools. But configuration is much harder in this scenario than it was with the monolith. Don't let that freak you out. Longer term, you basically don't have to manage a whole bunch of stuff like updates to EC2 instances all the time, and security and all of that. The other thing to kind of just point out here, services are part of the whole system. Your system is not your code that you keep in your little repo. The services, they count, which makes it harder. So we need those services to provide us, which they don't all do. We need the services to provide us with testing tools for those so that we can just add them into the code and configuration, so we can do integration testing and give us scenarios for doing that. At the moment, we don't have that. And also, I'd like a button in every single cloud account where I can press it and I can create a duplicate account. Wouldn't that be lovely? Because then we can do proper testing. It might take a while, but hey. I've kind of touched on testing as well. Yep. And so kind of where I see the future of serverless, I think we're at a really interesting point. But I think we're missing out on a whole bunch of tools at the moment. And the tooling is probably the biggest thing that we've found. You know, we've had to learn a lot of things ourselves and do them ourselves. Don't let that put you off. What we've found actually is that sysadmins are probably the best kind of person to start with serverless, because they've had to deal with a bunch of tools. It's not necessarily the coders who've built your website. You know, it's not that. It's those people who've had the experience of what a server is all about and how it works. And I think we're going to see more data service, more specialized data services. I'd love to have WebSockets, wouldn't you? So that we can just have an always-on connection to our systems. But I suspect that's probably more complicated to deliver. I think we do need more case studies. At the moment, a lot of the case studies are pushed by the vendors because not a lot of people are doing this kind of thing. So I'm kind of conscious that we need to do more and share more. You know, I'm standing here not because I'm selling you anything, but because we've had fun playing around with serverless for the last year, and we have found it works for us. So we want other people to be coming out with serverless problems and solutions so that we can benefit from it as much as anyone else. So I'm just saying that you know, this is a community we're developing. I'm not trying to sell you anything. Although, you know, come and talk to me afterwards if you want to come and work in the environment. But so I'm kind of going to. I've raced through that, but I wanted to give an opportunity for questions. So I'm going to say thank you. And kind of leave it up. There's some questions you may have about how you do serverless, how you use serverless, and everything else, but I'm just going to open it up at this point. Right at the back.
You said that Lambda out of all the past services is the most complete.
Yes.
But some of the other providers have, like, their experience seems to be more complete. What do you exactly mean by
Okay. So why do I say that AWS is more complete as a solution? I think it's the added services, and also the fact that AWS Lambda has been around a lot longer. I think there's a certain amount of experience that comes along with working with this, and the longer you spend with a technology, the more you realise, certainly with this kind of technology, the more you realise the parts around it are more important than function as a service is only one part of serverless. It actually it's kind of the core, but if you don't have the other services around it, you end up with problems in implementation later on. You have to basically hack together various bits and pieces to try and make it work in the way that you want it. And I think, much as I think there are significant improvements that AWS could make, I think they've done the best job so far. And we've kind of jumped in, and that's what the services we use. So. Have I got an example of where another provider is lacking? I could be really mean here. I think okay, so I'll tell you one thing I think is really good. I think that's probably one thing I think is better somewhere else, and that's, I think, with IBM and OpenWhisk. And I think the fact that OpenWhisk is open source, and it would allow me to run, for example, a data center. If I found a data center in a country, I could then run OpenWhisk on there, and that would give me my data protection thinking around that. You know, this is wider thinking. Also, Microsoft, for example, have a lot more data centers in lots more different places, and also connections in with managed service, on-prem services, so that if you then wanted to, at some point in the future, it's not quite there yet, wanted to run stuff in a country, you could do that on your own hardware. So I think there are things like that that AWS doesn't do that others do. So I think there are advantages, but it depends on what you're doing at the moment. But that means that you have to understand what you need and pick your providers accordingly. Yes?
I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on when you say code as infrastructure and using things
Yep.
like Terraform.
Yep.
Do you find all your infrastructure in one place, like one single repository, or do you break that up into the core services that need it?
So the question is, how do we structure our repositories in terms of config and code? So previously, up until very recently, we had code separate from configuration. And actually, very recently, we put them together. There were good reasons for having them separate and good reasons for having them together. But I think that given the size of the code now, it's more code fits in with configuration than code is separate. It's more like that. It's not. There are problems with both ways of doing it. But we've kind of taken the decision to say, Terraform, here's your infrastructure, here's your Lambda functions, essentially. And it also, with Terraform, it allows us to do things like change things in the functions. So if we want configuration in there, we can apply that alongside the infrastructure. So does that make sense? Yeah. So you're not separating, because otherwise you might have to do a manual step to change the code to add to the configuration. So yes, go on, follow up.
Oh yeah, follow up. Does that apply to, you said like all the surroundings of
Yep. Yes.
like things like databases,
Yep.
instances.
So yeah. So does that apply to all of the surrounding services? Yes, we've got Terraform has, I'm just going to look at Andrew here. It's got IAM, it's got DynamoDB, it's got Lambda, it's got API Gateway, it's got SNS. So we've got everything in a Terraform, which there's only a few things that aren't in there, mainly because Terraform doesn't provide it yet, but they're kind of more manual things. So we've also got an EC2 instance in there as well. We have one EC2 instance which runs as a proxy because one of our partners won't point at API Gateway because they want a fixed IP. 2016. Go.
You talked about the need for a serverless queue. Have you looked at Kinesis as a possible event source?
Yes. Yeah, we've looked at Kinesis. It was a lot more to do with the auditing than anything else. And you can also push your Kinesis streams to an S3 bucket and all that kind of various different ways of doing it. But the quickest and simplest way we found was to create a single table, push something into the table, and then check on, do a DynamoDB trigger, which then goes to a Lambda function, which then does the next thing. So we have looked at Kinesis, and there are various reasons why that was better and various reasons why it doesn't work. I think we still don't have the right queuing solution for a serverless architecture yet. I think there are things that some do, that are really good, and some others that don't.
Yeah, so how do you provision your DynamoDB tables? Like,
In what context?
Like, I find it a bit hard to, like, imagine you're working on a new service.
Mm-hmm.
To kind of,
How do you
like, what we do
provision, or do you mean how do you create the structure? How do you structure
like
it?
the provisioning on throughput, reads and writes.
Okay. So that's more for, I would point you at AWS people, but the way that we do it is we essentially just monitor it, and if it's not quite where we want, then we up it and down it and everything else.
Do with Lambda functions, like, which, or maybe
We don't do it dynamically.
all right.
Which I can see where you could do that, but we would up it if we were going to do something like download the data. But that's a special case. But we don't up it.
Hi, you spoke about tooling and
Yep.
the need to create your own.
Yes.
I appreciate you're a small team, so
Yes.
it's maybe about how you would scale
Yep.
this. But do you need different skills potentially for tooling? Do you have the same people writing your business logic as your tooling? Do you separate them out? What's your percentage?
Tooling.
How do you scale that?
How would we scale? So I'm trying to think how best to answer this. That's quite a complicated question. So basically, how do you manage the team and your tooling? That's a complicated question. I kind of want to say let's talk about that one later because it's quite convoluted. But just to say that we've had in terms of what we've had to do in the last year, we've had to build, basically the developer, whoever it is, developers have had to build their own tooling up to now, but we are a small team. In time, I can see that changing, but I would also say that I would expect every developer who works on this kind of a thing to have a pretty decent understanding of the need for the tooling. So I wouldn't ever separate out the developers from DevOps entirely, because I think because the code is so linked to the configuration through this kind of a structure, I think you end up needing to put more. You may need to put your own tooling in to get stuff done. So I think in the future you won't get that separation. It will be more closely linked. Go for it.
Okay. So as you go down this path,
Yep.
potentially you end up with quite a large estate
Yes.
in the serverless world.
Yes.
It's great.
Yes.
But I'm wondering, do you have an opinion on whether or not you group it all together,
Mhm.
deploy it in one big Terraform stack, or do you kind of try and break it up by domain? Or
Yep. So I would. So we have multiple AWS accounts that could do multiple different things. With a monolith, so let's kind of take it from there. So what we're all used to is you've got your Ruby on Rails and you chuck it onto into a container and do a bunch of stuff with it, and then you scale it. I think if you look at this in terms of each set is a single microservice. So there's a lot of conversation about Lambda being a microservice. I see it more as a nano service, and the microservice being a bunch of nano services, and they're all linked by the data that, they're all coupled essentially. So when you've got a bunch of services that are together, you would put them together, but then you would deploy them as a group. So you might have 20 of them, they might be deployed as a group, but you wouldn't then put something else that wasn't entirely linked into the same deployment structure. Yeah, so you would separate out, so you would have groups. By domain, I would think would be a good, so you would pick a way of separating it out, but you probably wouldn't have them all in one. Yeah, that's how I think about it.
As we decompose systems
Yep.
in this way, do you see a possible future where we'll build a system that uses best-of-breed services across different cloud providers?
Yes. So the question is, would we end up with a situation where you would use a Microsoft service and an AWS service and then an Auth0 or whatever? Absolutely. Use the tools for the right things. Now, the upside of using services from the same provider is you're used to dealing with one provider, and you can talk across different things with that one provider. That's the useful part of it. But they may not have the best tool. So, for example, search is is a very interesting one. Algolia, I think, is a very good solution for search, and that is not an AWS service. So there is no problem in having separate services to do various different things. It's just from a management point of view, it's just easier to have it all under one umbrella. That's my thinking. But if you come back to all about maintenance, it's all about reducing maintenance. Having separate providers, having 3 or 4 or 5 providers is more maintenance than having one. So there's a trade-off, and that's something that you can only figure out if, as you're going. Go on then.
What strategy did you choose for keeping your API gateway configuration in code?
So API gateway configuration, how did we do it in code? We've used Terraform, which has proved, that was probably the hardest part, wasn't it, of how we did. No, it wasn't the hardest part. I thought it was the hardest part. There were a whole load of other things that were harder. But no, we used Terraform for that. We looked at Swagger. We looked at a bunch of other things around that. Again, this comes back to maintenance. It was just easier to put as much as we possibly could into Terraform.
So you try to keep everything in Terraform.
Yeah, for us, that's how we've worked it, and I think it's proved to be a pretty good solution for the time being. It may go wrong at some point in the next 6 weeks. You never know, but I'm hoping not. Go for it.
Somewhere in the world, there's probably a Docker conference on right now.
Yep. Someone's mentioned Docker, everybody.
Containers are not the answer, you said.
Yes.
Discuss
Why containers aren't the answer? Yes, I can exactly explain why containers aren't the answer. They're essentially instances that are hidden. They're much more kind of, you don't have to run the server. That's the nice bit about them. You still have to write the code. And they're still monoliths. And they're still, the advantage of AWS Lambda is that if you've got 50 Lambda functions and 3 of them are the heavy lifting, it will scale the 3 heavy lifting ones and the 50 will just sit there doing nothing. If you've got a Docker container and you want to scale it and it needs to scale, and there's 3 heavy lifting functions in that one thing, it will scale the whole thing. Yes? So it's just that, it's decomposing it down to specific functions and then only scaling what you need. So I would suggest that Docker is a perfectly good solution for some reasons, for some things. So containerization works for some scenarios, but for most, you can almost certainly put a serverless scenario in instead of a Docker scenario. So why wouldn't you? We're at the right conference for that kind of comment. We've got a couple more questions. Hello?
Did you say you broke up the monolith and moved it to serverless? And if you did, have you got any tips on that process, choosing what to break off?
Okay, so yeah, what do you choose to break off? So we actually started greenfield. We didn't start with a monolith. But that's kind of one of the questions. How do you choose what to go towards? How do you choose? I would suggest that there is a process that I would take now, if I was doing it, and that is put everything behind an API gateway and then move one thing at a time. And take the easy things and then move everything else when you have the time. Because you can actually run your EC2 instances over here and you can run your API gateway with your Lambdas over here. So just stick everything behind an API gateway and then point it at your EC2 or your load balancer. And then when you go, actually, there's this one bit of heavy lifting that I wish we had as a Lambda function, just move that one thing over here. You're still using all the same databases, you're still doing all the same things. So you can move things over one at a time, rather than having to do a big bulk change. So that's how I would approach it. And I think, as when you're moving from servers to cloud, it's low-hanging fruit. What's the easiest thing to move? That, if it's critical, don't change that unless you know exactly what you're doing. But if it's non-critical, you could probably have a go pretty quickly. That's the one advantage of serverless, is that you can change one thing pretty quickly. So how long have I got? 2 minutes? Okay, 2 more questions. Go for it.
How do you do your CI and integration testing?
CI, we use Circle CI. So that's integrated with GitHub. So when we push to a certain branch, it launches CI, Circle CI tool, and then that just runs all the tests within that. Integration testing, that's to be done. But we now have the process that will now be, we will be doing that as part of the CI at that point. But essentially we have 2 branches and 2 CI connections, so that we can push to one branch and then it'll push to staging and then push to another branch and it'll push to live. So it's a good question. One last question.
You flashed up on one of the slides Apex, and then you
Yes.
talked about using Terraform directly. My understanding is Apex has been wrapped around Terraform, correct? If so, why did you choose to do Terraform?
Because Terraform was, because we were doing stuff well before Apex was around. So it's more the fact that when we looked at the tools at the time, Apex was really quite new or non-existent. I can't remember when we did it. And Terraform seemed to be the tool of choice within the AWS community. That was pretty much the decision that we made. And this is kind of the thing, you just have to pick a tool and go with it. I've got no problem with picking a tool, and I've got no problem with Apex being used. But I would suggest that a lot of the tools out there talk very much about AWS Lambda and API Gateway, but don't necessarily talk about the holistic rest of the services that you might add in. And that's where Terraform actually adds value, that you've got all the other things built in as well. So you can put those into configuration as code. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Cool. Have I got time for one more? No, I haven't. Come and talk to me later. I'm glad you enjoyed the talk, so thank you very much.